I've lived in car dependencies for pretty much my entire life. And today I was reminded of why I look forward to creating a lifestyle that is less dependent on cars. Now, living in a car dependent city, you know, was something that never really, dawned on me how much it, affects the way that I live. And before, I just never really thought about it. But after experiencing how a robust metro system can really, be more convenient than a car, and how, easy it is to get around using, public transportation, that pretty much, sealed the deal on me deciding to attempt to create a lifestyle that is less dependent on cars. And then once I, began to pursue financial independence, that also had me looking at car ownership through a different lens, financially, but probably not in the way that you, not in the, all the ways that you might think. So that's what I wanted to talk about in this video. I wanted to talk about the way that I think about living in car dependent, areas, and how it impacts different areas of your life, um, particularly financially, but also just in, how the types of decisions that you have to make, because like with location, going out, things of that nature, when you live in a place that you need a car to get around versus if you live in a place where you don't necessarily need a car to get around. And the two biggest things that pretty much sealed the deal for me was being able to experience the, metro and public transportation in Europe. I haven't made it to, Asia yet, but I look forward to traveling to like Japan one day, because I know their public transportation system is going to blow my mind. But I've experienced, public transportation systems in Europe, particularly in London and Portugal. And I've been to other places too, but these are just more recent, where the newer technology has been integrated into their public transportation system, and just, just being, you know, not just being amazed at how smooth public transportation was in those countries. And then, so that really is what kind of planted the seed of, what, this might not, they might be on to something here, that coupled with things being within walking distance from wherever you were. I'm like, this lifestyle seems like it's not half bad, that, planted the initial seed about considering, living a life where I don't need to own a car. And then once I actually was able to live in a, major metropolitan area in the US, which is more recent because I was just living in the DMV, and getting to experience, what a more, developed um public transportation system could be like, coupled with actually living in a more walkable neighborhood, that pretty much sealed the deal. I was able now, when I visited overseas, I was just on vacation and as a tourist, so I know it's different, taking public transportation as a tourist versus when you actually live there and you rely on public transportation. But I mean, I pretty much keep an open mind with that. And, like I said, after experiencing it, how it could be done here in the US with living in the DMV, I'm like, yeah, no, I think I can do this. Like, I'm pretty sure I can. Because the cool thing about it is, in one of the neighborhoods that I lived in, I was in the Northern Virginia area, and the grocery store was literally right around the corner from my apartment. So I literally could just walk through the courtyard and get to a grocery store, and I had done it on many occasions. And I rarely drove my car when I lived in the DMV because it just made more sense to take public transportation, you know, um, and not having to deal with the inconveniences of finding some places to park, and then living in a metro city where you have to pay for parking pretty much everywhere you go. For the most part, not everywhere, but for the most part, most places you had to pay for parking, which is an additional expense. To me, it just made more sense to take public transportation, so that's what I did, and it worked out great. But and then initially I kind of struggled with it a little bit because I had just bought my car and I really wasn't driving it. And I was like, man, I got this expense over here. I'm making a car payment on it. I'm paying all of this insurance on it. I'm barely really driving it. I was only really driving it to travel back and forth to Delaware, which I did quite often. So it was getting some miles on there just from that. But just day to day driving, it just wasn't, I really wasn't driving it. And I only would drive it to, like, primarily, go to um the grocery store and like things that were definitely farther out where I needed to drive, but it just wasn't getting driven. And so I kind of wrestled with that idea a bit. I was like, man, I'm paying for this car, I ain't barely even driving it. And you might be like, well, why didn't you just drive it more? Because to me it just didn't, it was more of an inconvenience in most cases to drive, because like I said, with trying to find somewhere to park, and then you end up having to park way, far away from where you're trying to go, where as if I just hopped on a bus, I could hop on a bus and it would literally drop me off like right in front of the place that I was going. So to me it just made more sense to take public transportation in most cases. So I kind of wrestled with that. But now that I'm back, living in Delaware, I'm just like, oh, I'm so glad that I have a car. I'm so glad I, have this car, because it's definitely a necessity, in Delaware. It's definitely a necessity to own, have a car to get around in Delaware. And one of the aspects about it is just, as far as owning a car, that I never really thought about until I started like becoming a bit more financially savvy. And this was more so, after I, learned about, the FIRE movement and actually pursuing financial independence. Now, don't get me wrong, I've always been pretty good. I've always been pretty good um, with managing debt and, and stuff like that. And I've always approached owning a car is just making sure that I got a car that wasn't above my means. So I always got something that I could afford, whether it was new or used. And I know, like, the traditional financial wisdom or the traditional financial advice would, tell you, oh, never buy a new car, because they depreciate as soon as you take them off the lot by like 30%. And, you need to buy used and, drive them and run them into the ground until the wheels fall off. I ain't about that life. Reason why I ain't about that life is because I actually am into cars. I love cars. Um, Cars is one of the things, cars are one of the things that bring me joy in my life. And so I feel like if it comes to something like a car, if, as long as you approach it with a solid financial plan, you know, for me, that solid financial plan was, making sure I got a car that was within my means, that wouldn't cause me financial stress, to make the car payment or anything like that, where, you know, and two, having a plan to pay off the car sooner, than the term of the loan. So if it was a 5-year loan, I, my goal, I would set my goal to pay it off in, let's just say, like 3 years, right? So just to save the money on the interest, and just making sure I get that bill, out of the way, right? So And then also even just having an emergency fund. Now, I didn't really understand how an emergency fund would come into play until after I started beefing up on my personal finance and pursuing financial independence. So, but that would also be part three of that, is just making sure you have money set aside to take care of any unplanned expenses, especially when it comes to cars, because that, happens all the time. You get a flat tire or something, whatever, you might need some money to make sure you can pay for something happening, right? So I'm not opposed to people buying new cars. Um, you know, so I'm not the best person to take that type of advice from. And I mean, like I said, I know all the financially optimal things to do when it comes to buying a car. But for me, when it comes to cars, that's just one area that I feel like I'm going to, you know, I don't want to say treat myself because, but, that's the area that I'm willing to spend the money on without having to cut the corners, because it's one of the things that I enjoy. Driving. I enjoy driving and stuff like that. And I like the process of shopping for a car that I feel fits me and my personality, right? And that's probably a trap too. But like I said, as long as you approach it with a sound financial plan, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. That's my rant about, new cars versus used car. Oh no. And then because also too, with the reason why I'm not opposed to buying a new car is because in my experience, I just don't have good luck with used cars. I always end up with a used car that starts off really good and then it ends up having some major mechanical, issue, some crazy maintenance that needs to be done on it. And to me, I just kind of got tired of dealing with that within the first like 3 years of me owning a car and having to do some like major repair. And honestly, I just was like, when you get these really nice cars that are used and stuff, it's like, why did that person let that car go? It's not always just because they upgraded to a new car, just because they wanted a new car. Because, you know what I mean? I think a lot of times these cars be messed up. But anyway, that's just me on my conspiracy type time. But I just got tired of dealing with it. And so, and I tried to do the whole just buy the used car to save the money, and et cetera, but it just never worked out for me. So I just approach buying a new car, with the financial mindset, and I just go from there, right? So that concludes my rant and my tangent about, owning a new car versus a used car. But that's not what this video about is about. This video is about, living in a car dependent, area, and taking my car in for the maintenance today. It just reminded me, of, yeah, this is one of the reasons why I look forward to creating a lifestyle where I'm not dependent on owning a car, because when I just think about all of the costs associated with it, you know, um, if you have a car payment, which I don't, thankfully I was able to pay this car off, but generally speaking, the car payment, the insurance, the maintenance, the gas, don't even get me started on the cost of gas, especially more recently, it's just out of control. But, when you just think of all of those other things that come along with owning a car and just thinking about the total cost of owning a car, it's an expense, that I'm looking forward to seeing or creating a life that without those expenses, you know what I mean? And that just will allow me to, redirect that money that I wouldn't be spending on transportation, on owning a car, to something else like my investments, you know what I mean? So yeah, I just was thinking about that today. Um as I was, at the, car, dropping my car off at the car dealership and stuff like that. And then just moving back home, it just kind of reinforced the idea, like, dang, yeah, I don't, it's nice having a car, especially when you need a car. You know what I mean? It's definitely nice having a car, but I'm just really looking forward to, living somewhere where it's not a necessity to have a car. Um, and just thinking about just overall just how living in a car dependent place like really shapes the decisions that you make, how it influences your finances, with all, all the things that you have to consider when owning a car. And so it's just things, just, just giving you things to think about, just when it comes to designing a life that you truly want to live. And this is definitely one of the things that I think about, is being in a place that, is not, where I don't need to own a car in order to get around, and still be able to get around with comfort and ease and convenience without owning a car. And it just all goes into the location freedom aspect, not just being able to live anywhere in the world and still, earn an income no matter where I live, but also wherever I'm at, still being able to move about freely without the dependence on such a, a major expense. That also ties into it. But let me know in the comments, do any of you live in a car dependent city or a major metropolitan area, and does that, you know, influence your decision about where you live? Like, do you look for a place that has a robust public transportation system, or do you not care either way? Let me know in the chat. Let me know in the comments so we can chat about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching my video today, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.